blind, have low vision, or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour I will be reading from Sunday's March 1st issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is written by Jamel Booley. What Trump hath wrought. For President Trump and his allies, the 2024 election was less a vote for a new administration than it was an enabling act for a new sovereign. Americans had done more than give Trump the White House the way it might bless any candidate with presidential power. In their view, the vote was all akin to regime change, the start of a new constitution, a new covenant, and a new commandment. Thou shalt not have no other laws before Trump. What followed in the first year of the president's second term was an effort to subordinate the entire society to the whims of one man. He did not do this alone, rather than defend its prerogative as the first branch among equals. The Republican-led Congress neutralized itself as a constitutional force. And eager to put in effect its baroque theories of unlimited presidential power, the Republican-led Supreme Court gave sanction to Trump's efforts to remake the executive branch in his image, even when history, tradition, law, and the will of the people through Congress said otherwise. Worse, in the month before Trump won his second election, the same court freed him from fear of criminal prosecution in an extraordinary declaration of presidential immunity. The court opened the door to rampant corruption and abuse of power, and Trump walked right through it. But his confidence as a president and his boyars, it's B-O-Y-A-R-S, a new word, I don't know what that means, friends perhaps, appeared to be in the first month. They were also in a race against the clock. The reality of the situation was that the American people, or at least a little less than half of the people who cast ballots in November 2024, did not vote for Trump to be an outer borough Viktor Orban. They voted for lower prices and greater prosperity, and I might add, immigration. And each moment the president spent on his ideological obsession was one he did not spend on the promises that put him into office. The most self-destructive of the president's obsession was a single-minded devotion to tariffs, which promised to undermine the economy and raise the cost of everyday life for millions of Americans. In fact, according to a recent report from the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, the president's tariffs cost the average household $1,000 a year. Then there was the immigration. As many voters heard it, Trump would direct the nation's resources toward people who had committed violent crimes, the worst of the worst, as he likes to put it. But as he, and especially Stephen Miller, his chief domestic policy advisor, meant it, mass deportation was a plan to remove as many brown-skinned immigrants from the country as they could, get their hands on undocumented or otherwise. If those immigrants were highly legal or had pending legal status, then the administration would target them as if they were criminals, seizing law-abiding people to send to squalid detention camps in Texas and Florida, where they would be deported to whatever country might take them. And if those immigrants had legal status, if they had done things the right way, then the administration would do everything it could to mollify their status so it could sign them with the full force of the federal government. When masked agents toting military-grade weapons as they seize people off the streets or from their homes, Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Border Patrol ceased to be law enforcement agencies, began to operate instead as state-sponsored paramilitaries, loyal to the leader and not to the rule of law. To assist them, the president would also turn the American military against the public with showy occupations of major cities, including the nation's capital, which would be adorned with images of glowing Trump as our dear leader, but Big Brother with a spray tan. But again, the clock was ticking. To remake the nation, Trump had to move fast. He had to consolidate a new authoritarian regime before the opposition could get its footing and before the broader public could react to its transformation. Winston Churchill said to have joked that Americans can always be trusted to do the right thing once all other possibilities have been exhausted. Something along these lines seemed to take place in 2025. Americans woke up to the president's assault on their liberty. They saw the unilateral destruction of federal agencies, the military occupation, the use of masked men to snatch immigrants, and the start of something dangerous, and they began to react, first with protest and then at the ballot box. On Tuesday, Trump gave his State of the Union address. What a difference a president makes, he said. Trump believes he is popular, strong, successful. The truth says otherwise. He is unpopular as he's ever been. One consequence of the president's deterioration with the public is that it has almost certainly led others to offer stiffer resistance than usual. In February, for example, the Supreme Court struck down his tariffs as unlawful, a gut punch to the domestic policy agenda. And the actions of ICE in particular have proved to be so unpopular that large majorities want the agency changed, reformed, or ended altogether. What Trump has a little more than a year into a second term is a failed presidency, one who has crashed on the rocks of his ambition to supplant constitutional government with the will. Yes, he has done tremendous damage. And yes, he has degraded American democracy to the point that it is on life support. But he's failed to make himself a dictator, and the public poised to punish his party for his transgressions. Unfortunately, that will be the easy part. It's what comes after that that will test our ability to make the Union whole again. Nicholas Kristof, The Folly of Attacking Iran. We Americans may be poised to start another Middle Eastern war based on dubious intelligence claims, once more without understanding the ramifications. It's beginning to sound like 2003, lamented Carl Bildt, a former Swedish prime minister, referring to the run-up to the Iraq war. Trump has painted himself into a corner, and it's not clear that he actually wants the unpopular war that he seems poised to begin. But how do you retreat if you're the president who told Iranians that help is on the way, stood by and has massacred and assembled the biggest military force in the region since the Iraq war? How do you prove it to egg prices? My suggestion is you cut a deal and declare it the greatest diplomatic triumph since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Trump did something like that when he gave up his war with the Houthis in Yemen last year, and again when the administration declared victory in the war on Minnesota and retreated. In this case, Trump suggested on Tuesday that Iran needs to avoid a war is to say those secret wars. We will never have a nuclear weapon. If that's the formula, we can get a deal. Iranian officials have been saying things for the years, although nobody finds the assurances terribly convincing. So the outlines of a face-saving deal are visible. Iran renounces nuclear weapons, again. It shuts down nuclear sites at Fordo, Nance, and Isfahan. It suspends uranium enrichment for several years and says that after that it will enrich only to very low levels in above-ground facilities for medical purpose, all under rigorous inspections. And it commits to giving up its stock of highly enriched uranium. Trump could then claim to have gotten a better deal than President Barack Obama. Such a nuclear deal would still be dissatisfying. It would not address Iran's missiles and would leave in place a regime that has just massacred thousands of protesters, at least 6,800, and perhaps many more, according to human rights activist news agency. So why not just bomb Iran and see the regime collapse as Iranians dance to the streets? For starters, air wars are unlikely to topple the government. The U.S. under President Biden and Trump spent more than $7 billion bombing Yemen and couldn't dislodge even the Houthis. Americans may also have to sunny a view of what war with Iraq would entail. With war with Iran would entail, because Iran barely responded to the assassination of Soleimani in 2020 or to the bombing of nuclear sites last year. My guess is that Iran feels it now must reestablish deterrence and would be more likely to attack military bases, strike ships in the Strait of Hormuz, although which 1/5 of the world's oil passes, organize terror attacks against American targets worldwide. The point of military action to make us safer, but Iran most likely won't pose a substantial threat to America in the coming years. Despite claims by Trump or his aides, its missiles probably can't reach the U.S., and its nuclear program is entombed and apparently on pause. By attacking Iran, we would be creating risk, not reducing it. One risk I worry about is that Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, acting either independently or at the behest of the White House, could set things off by attacking Iran, leading it to fire back, and then Trump would join the war. This does sound like 2003 Redux. For once more, it feels as if we may sleepwalk into a Middle East war. Iraq has repressive and unpopular government, as Iran does. In my visits to Iran over the years, I've seen deep anger in the government's corruption, hypocrisy, and economic incompetence, and I suspect that has increased since the massacre in January. I reached out to the Iranian human rights lawyer, Nasrin Sotoudeh, whose courage and defiance of the regime have periodically landed her in jail. She told me that the best time for military strikes would have been January, when they might have stopped the slaughter in the streets. Sotoudeh, like some other Iranians, seems ambivalent about military action today. Before the massacre, she said her position was, you can't bomb your way to democracy. Now, repulsed by the bloodshed, she says she favors outside humanitarian intervention to protect protesters, but not in the form of unilateral military attacks. I think that's right. In my view, not Sotoudeh's, the United States can try to knit together the fragmented opposition and work to destabilize the militias. It can also smuggle in many more Starlink terminals so that Iranians can communicate. The intelligence community can prioritize investigations of the corruption of the leadership. I love to see leaks illuminating the wealth of the top Iranian officials or report their children and grandchildren enjoying their Sephardic lifestyles at home and abroad. This might not be effective, and it's less dramatic than blowing up oil refineries, but in 1979, it was not machine guns that toppled the Shah, but rather smuggled cassette tapes of sermons and songs. When you visit the horror of war, you believe it should be the last resort, not an abyss we tumble into without legal basis or clear objective, simply because our president dispatched an armada to the region and doesn't quite know what to do next. Japan's era of post-war restraint is ending. Ever since Japan's defeat in World War II, the country's place in the world has been shaped by deliberate policy of restraint. Under its pacifist post-war constitution, Japan has for decades kept its military budget modest, sheltered under the U.S. security umbrella, and has avoided directly provoking an increasingly assertive China. Japan's people, scarred by the trauma of World War II, supported that approach. But last month's landslide electoral victory by Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, a hardliner who openly advocates a tougher approach to China and a more robust Japanese military, suggests that an era may be ending. The implications for the region could be profound. Caught between the more aggressive China and less predictable U.S., many in Japan are coming to the realization that caution is no longer enough to guarantee their security. If this trajectory continues, likely to result in a U.S. ally that is more assertive, militarily capable, and central to deterring China. It is crucial that the United States encourage this evolution while ensuring that it strengthens rather than weakens regional stability. The changing Japanese mindset did not begin with Ms. Takaichi. It has been years in the making as the global landscape has shifted, particularly with China's rise in assertive military power. China has increasingly sent ships to Japanese-administered islands in the East China Sea, carries out threatening military maneuvers around Taiwan. Chinese expansionism or a conflict in the region would endanger the sea lanes and supply chains upon which Japan's trade-dependent economy relies. With these threats in mind, Japan reinterpreted its constitution in the mid-2010s under former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to broaden the circumstances under which could use military force. Mr. Abe also created National Security Council strengthened decisions, making on military matters and increased defense ties across the Indo-Pacific. His successors, especially Fumio Kishida, continued the arc, approving the largest defense buildup since World War II and endorsing Japan's ability to strike back if attacked, a shift considered politically unthinkable. Ms. Takaichi has indicated a willingness to take things even further. In November, she implied that Japan could intervene militarily if China attacked Taiwan, the self-governing island democracy that Beijing claims as its territory. It was one of the clearest public signals by a Japanese leader in years that the country could come to Taiwan's aid, and Beijing responded angrily with punitive economic measures. Japanese voters were not intimidated, handing Ms. Takaichi, I don't know how to pronounce it, it's Takaichi, Takaichi, and the long-ruling Liberal Democratic Party a supermajority of two-thirds of the seats in the 465-member lower house of Parliament. The first political party to achieve that in the post-war era. That represents a historic mandate to a country whose prime ministers typically govern with narrow margins and must make deep compromises to their agenda to appease party or coalition factions. Ms. Takaichi may now have the political leverage, indeed, to succeed where Mr. Abe, her mentor, fell short, revising Japan's constitution to loosen constraints on the military. Article 9 of the Constitution renounces war and forbids maintaining a war potential. Japan has, in fact, built highly capable self-defense forces over the decades. But Article 9 served as a political guardrail, sustaining informal limits on military spending, offensive capabilities, and forever cease deployment. Revising the Constitution would even mean an overnight change, but the eventual consequences could be far-reaching, formally recognizing a more conventional role for the military, clearing the way for higher spending and expanded operations beyond Japan's shores. I spent years talking to policymakers in Japan, where revision of Article 9 was always discussed cautiously as a distant future aspiration. Now, in the wake of Ms. Takachi's election win, there's a different feeling. A meeting across Tokyo that I took part in recently. Liberal Democratic Party lawmakers and cabinet officials spoke about constitutional revision as a plausible near-term objective. Japanese TV commentators, who once treated the topic as abstractions, now debate timelines. Ms. Takachi still must tread carefully, given lingering political sensitivity over the issue. Her room for maneuver could narrow further if her expansion economic plans aid to rising inflation. But the tone in Tokyo has clearly shifted. A normalized Japanese defense posture could force Beijing to reassess its behavior in the region, including to coerce activities aimed at Taiwan. Up to now, China has felt free to increasingly flex its muscles, knowing that one of America's closest allies and one of the world's richest economies and most advanced democracies was constitutionally prevented from exercising its full military potential. No one in Asia is eager for an arms race, and a more military capable Japan will inevitably stir painful memories in places that suffered under Japanese wartime occupation, particularly China and the Korean Peninsula. But today's strategic choices must be governed by present geopolitical realities. A constrained Japan may have been in America's interest in the decades following World War II, but not anymore. A Japan that is willing to share more of the responsibility and cost of ensuring security in its neighborhood is likely to be welcomed by President Trump, who has pushed for U.S. allies to do just that. That is especially important at a time when American power is stretched by threats to peace around the globe and the nation is politically divided. Washington should embrace the potential for greater Japanese strategic autonomy as a sign and alliance adapting to modern realities. A stronger Japan is not a cure-all. If accompanied by nationalist rhetoric or provocative actions, it could unsettle the region rather than steady it. The aim should be instead to project quiet, credible strength. This will require restraint in Tokyo, discipline in Washington, and close, careful coordination between the two allies. An early chance to displace unity will come this month when Ms. Takachi is expected to make her first visit to the White House for talks with Mr. Trump. The Trump will come ahead of a planned visit to China by Mr. Trump at the end of the month. The two leaders already hit it off. Mr. Trump offered his total endorsement of Ms. Takachi before her February 8th snap election was a strong show of solidarity in Washington. Should be used to make clear to Beijing the emerging realities. The question is not whether Japan will act more like the power it already is. Global changes are already pushing it in that direction. It is how the momentous change is managed in Tokyo, Washington, and across the region. Historians confirm tomorrow won't be better than today. Humans' capacity for hope is an essential quality, but hope can turn into delusion. An editorial comment, Julie Woodruff from PBS interviewed a gentleman in Vermont and said, "What does it be to be an American?" And he said, "Fractured." And I asked some other folks, "What does it feel like to be an American?" And all the answers was, "I am proud to be an American, but I have some reservations, and some would be ashamed, and some would be confused, and some would be worried." To live in Berlin under the Nazis, World War II must have been an extraordinary experience. To be deported to death camps, if one was one of the 10,000s of Jews who were still alive and living in Berlin, was horrific. For non-Jews living in a police state, it was frightening enough. Being bombed day and night in the last 2 years of the war was surely kind of terrifying. The terrorism of the Nazi state was often in plain view. If you lived in Grunewald, one of the wealthiest parts of Berlin, you could have seen Jews being marched to the railway station, from which freight trains, packed with humans left for the ghettos and death camps in Eastern Europe. Others would have seen neighbors dragged from their homes. In some cases, they could have heard the screams of prisoners in the forced labor camps that were spread all over the city. And yet, most people looked away, pretending to see nothing, and carried on with their lives. Why? As is so often the case under autocratic regime, from Hitler's Berlin to Mussolini's Rome to Putin's Moscow, things go from bad to worse in stages. Today's outrage is tomorrow's normal. People adapt and get used to it. And another editorial comment that's very interesting. If we lived during this time in Berlin, and my dear listener and I were good people, and we saw this happening, what would we have done? My interest in what happened in Berlin during the war was sparked by my dad's letters from the Nazi capital between 1943 and the end of the war. A student in the Nazi-occupied Netherlands, he was deported to Germany as a forced laborer. His life was far from normal, but even as an willing foreign worker, he was able to observe the daily life of Germans, who often appeared to be oblivious to the horrors taking place around them. In a letter to his sister during the winter of 1944, when Berlin was being bombed day and night, he describes a concert by the Berlin Philharmonic conducted by Wilhelm Furtwängler, with the audience and the musicians huddled in thick coats under a roof filled with holes from British and American bomb shells. Almost until the last stages of the war, when Soviet army occupied Berlin in devastating battles that reduced the city to rubble, the cinemas were full. The dance venues were in full swing. The soccer competition went on. People visited the zoo and sunbathed in the Wannsee opposite the famous villa where the logistics of the Holocaust were worked out over glasses of brandy. One reason for public docility in terrible circumstances is fear. In the last years of the war, Berliner could be arrested and often executed for doubting the final German victory, for defeatism. But there is something more insidious, something not unfamiliar to many of us today. The hope that brings will turn out all right soon, that the political outrages are temporary, or at least that they can't get worse. One way of dealing with bad time is to pretend that they are normal. This is the problem when the destruction of moral norms and the rule of law is incremental. Germans should have known that politics would either take a criminal turn as soon as Hitler and his brutal paladins grabbed total state power in August 1934. The racial laws of 1935 robbed Jews of their civil rights, but Jews made up less than 1% of the German population, so most people could live with the racial laws. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria and grabbed a chunk of Czechoslovakia. Okay, perhaps that would satisfy the Fuhrer's imperial lust. He surely wouldn't go any further. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, it was clearly too late for normal life to resume. But even then, many Germans believed that Britain and France would not resist. Surely the war would soon be over. Erich Ellenfeld, a Jewish banker married to a Gentile wife, wrote a letter to Goering asking to serve in the invading army. After all, he was still a German patriot. He never received an answer. And so life continued. People kept hoping that the next act of war and assault on decency would be the final one, and the nightmare would finally end. Even in 1945, when terrifying Soviet artillery was in earshot and much of Berlin lay in ruins, there was still hope that wonder weapons, fearsome missiles that would destroy and demoralize London, or machines that would put Allied bombers from the skies like giant magnets, would turn things around. The human capacity for hope is an essential quality. With the hope, there can be no improvement. But hope can also turn into delusion. The United States today is not Hitler's Third Reich. We are nowhere near the disastrous circumstances of Berlin is in 45, 39, or 35, or even 34. But as humans, we are prey to similar kinds of self-deception. When Donald Trump refused to say whether he would accept the outcome of the election in 2016, people should have sensed the danger. And yet at the time, respected intellectuals told me that everything would be fine. All he wanted was to play golf or make money. Hillary Clinton and George Bush were worse, for they condoned or unleashed unnecessary wars. I was told by a well-known American historian that there was really nothing to worry about, for after all, Roosevelt once had authoritarian tendencies too. Democracy will never be shattered, a law professor assured me, for Americans love freedom too much. Since then, one red line after another has been crossed. Undocumented immigrants are called animals. Civilian boats are blown out of the water. American citizens are gunned down in the street and then accused of being domestic terrorists. Universities, new organizations, law firms are being bullied and blackmailed. And refugees are deported to countries whose language they probably don't even speak. And that is aside from the blatant corruption of family and cronies. All of this was incremental to, but compared with 1934, everything goes much faster, and yet life continues as usual. What was unthinkably only yesterday, we now take in stride, and we wait for that moment when things really have gone too far this time. Then the fever breaks and things revert to normal, but that moment probably won't come. Things have gone too far too many times already. Hoping for better still, the right attitude, but only as long as we prepare for the worst. Editorial comment. That's a very sobering article. For all the items he mentioned, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat has little value what I'm talking about. If we don't have the rule of law, we're just in trouble. For this White House, math is hard. Candidates for quantitative jobs like those on Wall Street or in Silicon Valley are sometimes asked questions such as, how many ping pong balls fit in a 747? Called Fermi problems. These questions aren't meant to elicit a precise, correct answer, but are there to test an interviewer's reasoning ability. The candidates must use mathematical relationships of scale and dimensions to arrive at a reasonable guess. If the volume of ping pong balls were X, and that of the airplane Y, then they sought after quantity as Y divided by X. The problems enforce the basic discipline of combining what is known and observable with rigid mathematics to make sensible statements about the unknown or the unobservable. In the past year, President Trump and members of his administration have shown that they would fail miserably in such interviews. Many administrations boast about their success and perhaps exaggerate. But Mr. Trump and others have made quantitative claims that stretch not only the bounds of factual truth, but of mathematical possibility. In his State of the Union address on Tuesday evening, Mr. Trump repeatedly claimed the administration has made before, that prescription drug prices have been reduced by as much as 600%. On its face, 600% reduction in drug prices would require a pharmaceutical company to pay you 5 times overtake a medication. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has previously partially defended the claim by saying the percentage reduction is measured relative to the final price rather than the initial one. So going from 100 to 25 would represent a 300% price reduction. But that is not what those words mean. When President Joe Biden's inflation reduction of 22 resulted in 79% decrease in some drugs, would the Trump administration have wanted to frame that achievement as a 376% reduction? Attorney General Pam Bondi has claimed that the administration's fentanyl seizures have saved 110 million American lives, later revised to 250 million, a number that would present a plague on par with the Black Death. Mr. Trump has claimed that his tariffs and other efforts have generated $18 trillion to new investments in the U.S., more than half the country's gross domestic product, which represent a rate of economic growth that dwarfed even the greatest periods of post-war II. Doesn't take a policy expert to fact-check these statements. Elementary number sense and some understanding of the world reveal that these numbers are grossly out of scale. These claims mark an escalation in the use of statistics as rhetorical decoration rather than a support by arguments constrained by shared rules. From the perspective of a math educator, this is not a minor abuse of statistics, but a failure of epistemic responsibility, one that undermines the possibility of public reasoning itself. A new word for me, epistemic, epistemic. Don't know what it means. Mr. Trump's claims do not invite debate. They short-circuit it. Why even bother arguing with a recent claim by Mr. Trump's Department of Homeland Security implying that it could deport 100 million people, approximately double the total amount of immigrants in the entire country? These numbers go beyond plausibility because true to being inconsistent with no mathematical axioms and definition. One of the most striking things about the world of mathematics is the frequency with which people have their minds changed by persuasive arguments. I see this every day in my classroom. This is why innumeracy in public matters even when dishonesty is expected. Mathematics education is valuable not only because it prepares people for technical jobs, but because it helps to cultivate a more basic civic capacity. Students learn that the numbers impose constraints that are non-negotiable, that definition must be attended to carefully, and that claims that yield when sufficient reasoning shows they cannot be true. The definition of a prime number is, for me, as it was for Euclid, and for 2047 will never be a prime, no matter how much I desire it. These habits of thinking, humility before evidence, respect for shared definition, and a willingness to revise are what can make a disagreement productive rather than insurmountable. When leaders abandon them, numbers will power to clarify and instead become cudgels to use against opponents, leaving the public without a common basis to judge common claims. We can and must hold our political leaders to a higher standard. When officials use absurd numbers, it shows that they believe the Americans are incapable of critiquing them. After the Trump era is over, much will be said about the lasting damage this has done to civic discourse. In addition to other reforms and acts of reconciliation, repairs will be made to the ways of engaging in public argumentation and decision-making, particularly in the use of statistics. Before we can disagree productivity, we must use a common faith that some truth exists and are capable of being discovered. Perhaps a refresher course in basic math. could be a truthful place for everyone to start. The Trump administration's war on science has a human cost. "13 months in the second Trump administration, science, medicine, public health have been hijacked by a cadre of grifters and ideologues and by politicians in obvious thrall to both. Federal institutions have been all but dismantled. Researchers have been defunded en masse, and the universities that support them deliberately established. Discourse on crucial scientific questions and key public health challenges have been stifled. And along the way, trust has been broken between scientists and the nation's leaders and the people that both are supposed to serve. In attempting to view this undoing as temporary, Americans love science and revere innovation almost as a rule, and politicians of every stripe have spent the better part of a century promoting and protecting both. However imperfect the resulting system was, hardly a modern convenience exists that can't be traced back to it. Central air conditioning, the internet, polio vaccines, statins, weight loss drugs, human genome sequence. The National Institute of Health alone generates about 2.50 in economic returns for every dollar of investment. It's also the largest government-funded biomedical research agency in the world, and until recently was the envy of scientists across the globe. The president's attack on this legacy has been relentless and all-encompassing. He has turned the federal health department over to Robert Kennedy Jr., the nation's most prominent anti-vaxxer. For months, President Trump's office and management and budget all but froze operations for the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health. His newly established so-called Department of Government Efficiencies, or DOGE, fired thousands of civil servants from the Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in a process that was wildly disorganized, frequently unlawful, and needlessly cruel. Global health initiatives were also eviscerated. Stacked against these measures, the administration's explanations, which focus on cutting waste and eliminating so-called woke politics from science, have been inadequate and disingenuous. It can be difficult to imagine a future in which American science does not prevail. But as the president's many critics have warned, institutions like the CDC, FDA, and NIH will be far more difficult to rebound than they have been to destroy, especially if their intended beneficiaries lose all faith in them or forget why they existed in the first place. The current administration seems to understand as much. Top officials have been taking pains to describe the nation's scientific bodies as corrupt and ineffective, and the nation's scientists as elitist and excessively woke. Science and public health have achieved much more than current leaders seem to recognize, said Tom Frieden, the author of Formula for Better Health and president of the public health nonprofit Resolve to Save Lives. We actually know a lot about how to make America healthier, but very little of that knowledge is in line with what the current administration has done so far. Nowhere in this discomfort of fuller display than in the long war against HIV. 40 years ago, infection was a mystery and a death sentence. Today, thanks to a combination of biometrical breakthrough and diligent boots-on-the-ground public health testing, education, robust social safety nets, it is a chronic but manageable condition that really flourishes only among society's most marginalized groups. The first Trump administration vowed to finally end the American HIV epidemic no later than 2030 by doubling down on preventive efforts in the hardest hit communities. The resulting initiative has clearly paid off. Transmission rates are down in their target zip codes, and according to the National Minority AIDS Council, a nonprofit devoted to stopping the virus spread, racial health gaps are narrowing as a result, and because prevention is cheaper than treatment, money's being saved. On March 20 of last year, Catherine Magapalgal, that's Macapalg, a clinical psychologist and a faculty resident at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine, was sitting in her law's dining room table when her phone and laptop began pinging and ringing furiously. Ping, the Adolescent Trials Network, a huge research apparatus focused on treatment and preventing HIV infection in teenagers and young adults, was abruptly closed. The network was responsible for studies at the Macapalgal and her colleagues were collaborating at. Ping, close colleagues' 10-year study in HIV, substance and LGBTQ teenagers, young adults was suspended. So was another project of reducing HIV risk in relationships. Ring, another of our projects on how to improve the measurement of sexual orientation and gender identity in federal surveys, was also done. So were at least 2 fellowship programs for early career scientists who wanted to specialize, as she did, in LGBTQ health, and dozens of other projects affecting just about everyone she worked with on her or knew her professionally. Her husband, Dan Freiberg, also a scientist, also relying on NIH funding, paced frantically behind her as she announced each new bit of carnage. At this rate, you'll be out of a job by dinner time, he said. Oh my God, what are we going to do? I cannot go there right now, she replied. She was determined to remain calm. She was also too stunned to panic. Although in truth she was not surprised, her research sat in just about every one of the administration's crosshairs, all of her projects, including the new red flags, and most of the researchers of her staff fell into at least one disfavored category. All of their salaries, including hers, were relying on NIH funding, and all of their jobs were now gravely imperiled. And not just theirs, federal grants were the lifeblood of academic research. They supported scientists and students, institutes, and administrators. They covered overhead costs. It was not uncommon for one person to be funded by several grants, nor was it rare for professors at Macapalgal working at elite universities like Northwestern to be wholly dependent on grants that had to be renewed every few years. It was a deeply precarious arrangement, sustained for decades by the certainty that come what may, the federal government would honor its commitment. When the dust finally settled, 4 of Macapalgal's grants had been terminated. Nearly a quarter of her salary was gone, and a project she had spent many months developing was on seemingly permanent hold. As they struggled to make sense of what was happening, she and her colleagues found themselves drawing grim battlefield analogies. It was as if a bomb had gone off, and some of them were dead on the field, while others like her were maimed. One colleague who lost everything told me that he thought, I actually had it worse, he said, because if you were going to die, it's probably better to do it quickly. There are about 1.2 million people living with HIV in the United States, and more than 60% are black or Latino. Transgender women, gay and bisexual men, and teenagers and young adults of color face the greatest overall risk of contracting the virus in any given year. Those inequities are no mystery: less access to health care, more social stigma, and a negative feedback loop. We're in a higher prevalence of the virus in certain community begets a higher prevalence of the virus in certain communities, but resolving them is no small feat. In the year leading to 2025, as she tried to do exactly that, Mac Pagal was consumed by several thorny challenges, a troubling dichotomy emerging since the medication that prevents HIV. It's not unlike birth control when it was first introduced. If it's pretty straightforward as a treatment, but it's attached to all of this cultural baggage, that makes it less. Another editorial comment. The grim effects of Doge is not so good. Cornyn and Baxter hunt. It's a GOP showdown in Texas. There is little that is dull or small in the state of Texas, and certainly not in politics. This week brings a high-stakes showdown in the Senate Republican primary. John Cornyn, a Bush-era Republican, will try to hold on to a seat against challenger from Ken Paxton, the fiery Trump-aligned state attorney general, and Wesley Hunt, a two-term congressman. Times Opinion assembled a panel of experts from Texas for a new installment of The Choice. This is the first of several panels we will convene in a year of political midterm races that will serve as a referendum on President Trump's tenure in office. The Choice was prepared by Times Opinion editors based in part of the roundtable conversations. Immigration deportation. This is one of the state's most defining issues and profoundly important to its voters. In the past year, Texans have been a sharp decline in illegal border crossing. Times Opinion. How do you rate the Trump administration's handling of border security and how it will resonate in Texas? James Henson, government professor. The issue with both security in Texas right now is a dog catcher's car situation. It's perceived by a lot of people as kind of being solved. We dined out for a long time in terms of reporting our political data by saying, if you wanted to unify Republicans, talk about border security, and you'll get 50, 60, 70% agreeing with you. Now that border security seems to be solved, well, you've seen its salience decline. And when you break down the policy applications, it introduces a lot of division among Republicans that were not there when the focus was simply, we need to enforce the border. Brendan Steinhauser, a consultant in Austin, in Texas among Hispanic Republican, I think the president has lost some of those people because of the government's tactics. They're like, wait, we were for this, not for that. Lee Hagan, a consultant in Houston, everything that I see from Rio Grande Valley for those counties that were along the border, those Latinos are staying strong. They stand by Trump's stance on the border on deportation. Atemio Muniz, an attorney in Houston, when the administration first started out, there was strong support, but now you're seeing ICE guys shoot people and becomes this chaotic thing. And political reflects that. So the Republican Party has to make a decision. Are they going to understand this and find a way to scale it back? Or are they just going to keep going full throttle? Kel Silik, former state senator from Amarillo. There is very, very little disagreement about border security. It's how you go about it. Having a military force, and for all the world looks like security forces in a banana republic, in a place like Minnesota, is not the answer. Susan Belsigner, news publisher. Everybody wants a secure border, so that's not really where the conversation needs to be. Cornyn is probably the one that has the most pragmatic approach to all of it. The other two candidates seem to be more firebrand on this issue. Just a little quick biography of the three candidates. John Cornyn is a four-term incumbent who has moved to the right in the primary. Ken Paxton is a Trump-aligned attorney general who commands a devoted populist following. And Wesley Hunt is a U.S. House member whose candidacy added a wild card in the race. One other opinion here. Chet Hasty, radio host. None of these guys are going to come out and say ICE raids are bad. Trump is bad. They're not going to do that. So for primary voters, it comes down to, are these candidates going to support Trump? I think a lot of folks nationally still don't understand that when it comes to what policies they like, what policies they disagree with, there's not just one thought within the Hispanic community in Texas. For the general election, that's where the big question is. But is that going to cause somebody to stay home and vote for the Democrat who's going to be branded open border? Not likely. Times opinion. Which candidate do you have confidence in to advocate for Texas in this issue in Washington? You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from Sunday, March 1st, issue of the New York Times opinion section. We read from the New York Times opinion section every Sunday at 2 p.m. Your reader has been Dick Shanley, and thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another